Welcome to PHRP Perspectives, your go-to resource for navigating ethics, compliance, and best practices in human subjects research. Each episode delivers expert insights, practical advice, and real-world stories to help you stay ahead and make informed decisions. PHRP Perspectives is brought to you by PHRP Online Training.
Earn your certification for human subjects protection training with PHRP Online Training. PHRP offers 2 courses: PHRP Online Training for biomedical or clinical topics, and PHRP SBE, which is designed for social, behavioral, and educational research. Continuing education credits are available for a variety of professionals. PHRP Online Training is available in English, Spanish, and French. Learn more at phrptraining.com.
And now, here is PHRP Perspectives, Ethics, Research, and Compliance. Hello, I'm your host, Susan Cord, and joining us on PHRP Perspectives are Richard Klein, PHRP Advisory Board Member, and his guest, Lisa Kearns. Today's episode is IRB Considerations for Treatment Use Protocols in Investigational Products. Richard is an internationally recognized expert in human subjects protection and expanded access to unapproved therapeutic agents. His career at the FDA spanned more than 40 years. He helped develop the original common rule, as well as revised expanded access regulations and guidances. Currently, he is Director of Expanded Access Programs and Policy at the GE2P2 Global Foundation and a member of the New York University Working Group on Compassionate Use and Preapproval Access, or CUPA. His guest, Lisa Kearns, is a Senior Research Associate in the Division of Medical Ethics at NYU's Grossman School of Medicine. She has spoken and published extensively on the ethical issues surrounding pre-approval and expanded access to investigational drugs, including state and federal right-to-try legislation. Lisa is a member of the division's working groups on compassionate use and pre-approval access and on pediatric gene therapy and medical ethics. She is also the associate director of the division's high school bioethics project. Welcome to both of you. Richard, start us off by explaining the importance of today's topic and why you'd like to discuss this with Lisa.
Well, thanks a lot, Susan. That is the place to start off. Why is this an important topic? Expanded access has existed and evolved in the United States since the 1970s. But for much of that time, it was really underneath the radar. Since the HIV epidemic, growing attention to advances in rare diseases, patient advocacy, controversies about right to try, and even a growing interest in real-world evidence, public awareness of expanded access has become very common, and people are much more interested in it. So it's become much more likely that IRBs are going to come across expanded access in their work. And we thought it would be useful to just talk a little bit about what the role of the IRB is in expanded access. And Lisa and I are going to talk about what expanded access is, why IRBs are involved, and why their involvement is so important. Lisa, you spent a lot of your academic career studying expanded access. Can you start us off talking about what expanded access actually is?
Yeah, happy to do that. Hi, everyone. Glad to be here. Expanded access is an FDA pathway, also known as compassionate use, via which patients in certain conditions are able to access drugs in development outside of clinical trial before they're approved by the FDA. Now, these patients must not have a comparable or satisfactory alternative treatment option. They must have a very serious or life-threatening disease or condition, and the benefits to the patient must outweigh the risk to the patient, and this is assessed by a physician in consultation with the patient. Importantly, the patient is unable to enroll in a clinical trial, and the sponsor providing this drug does not threaten the development of this agent via the clinical trial process. It's very important to protect the integrity of clinical trials because that's how drugs get approved and on the market so many more people can use them. I did want to stress two things about expanded access that I think are important for today. First, it's the drug company's or the sponsor's decision whether to allow access to its drugs in development. FDA or IRB does not get involved until the sponsor has agreed to provide this access. And second, access is considered a pathway to treatment. These are very sick patients we're talking about. They're looking for a way to benefit themselves, and expanded access is considered like their generally last best hope for something that will help them in their lives. I emphasize this treatment. It's clinical care, as we also call it. It's important for our discussion of the IRB's involvement. Patients are being treated via this pathway, but the drug or device or biologic is experimental, it's investigational, and investigational drugs are drugs that are being researched. So remember, research is intended to create generalizable knowledge, and treatment is intended to help a patient. So I'll ask you back, Richard, as someone really well versed in regulatory oversight, to explain this seeming inconsistency. If expanded access is treatment, why are IRBs involved in the first place?
Well, yeah, I guess that's a good question. And it is counterintuitive. Even though the intent and the regulations do make that clear, the intent of expanded access is treatment. But the fact that the agent that's being used, the drug, the device, the biologic, is investigational means that the patient still needs to be consented. And the IRB has that really important responsibility of making sure that the consent is adequate to ensure that the patient knows that they're getting an investigational unapproved drug, that even though they're not enrolled in research, they're getting a drug that requires informed consent because there are uncertainties about the effectiveness of the product, and there are potentially unknown risks. So those need to be communicated to the patient so they can make an informed decision about whether or not they want to continue with that treatment. So even though it's not research, the use of the investigational product requires the informed consent as if it were research.
Right.
So 21 CFR Part 50 governs the informed consent in this country, in the United States, and is written for research. So it would not be unreasonable, and you might be thinking, don't the human subject protection rules require that informed consent include a statement that specifically says the study involves research? That is true. And FDA clarified in its guidance, this is the guidance of expanded access to investigational drugs for treatment use, questions and answers. This is guidance for industry. They clarified that the disclosure that there is an agent that's investigational will fulfill the requirement for saying this is research, even though it is treatment. So in the resources, you can find that guidance. Specifically, question 14 responds to that question.
Excellent.
So informed consent is actually important and fundamental to medical ethics. And Lisa, maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, you probably saw me nodding along vigorously when you were talking about informed consent and how difficult it is in general. Informed consent, as you can imagine, when you're talking about patients who are in what we call dire straits health wise, it's their tolerance for risk goes up, and often it's difficult to assess risk accurately when you are faced with no other choices. And these kinds of problems are amplified if you're a parent of a sick child trying to do what's best for your child and do keep your child healthy at any cost. So that the informed consent process is really, really important here, and that's a really important reason why IRBs are involved, because you have somebody looking out for the patients who may not be in the clearest head to look out for themselves. It's also important, there's this idea of therapeutic misperception and therapeutic misconception, which I won't go into a lot here, but I will just say that in this context, there's a chance that patients who are requesting access to a drug via expanded access may, in fact, just overestimate the effectiveness of this drug. But it is important to remember that, as I keep saying, it's considered a treatment for the patient, but it is investigational and has not been established as effective either for their condition or for people in their condition. Again, they have unique circumstances, possibly comorbidities, and that's why this IRB oversight is so important. And, I'm guessing patients who are requesting drugs via expanded access probably don't care about the research treatment dichotomy, and that's why you have IRBs to care for that. Um, one thing I wanted to ask you back, Richard, is that you referred to some FDA resources, and I know they're really helpful to patients who are looking for expanded access. And I will call out the FDA's expanded access page and website as a really good one for patients, physicians, and industry. It's divided into those sections, so it's quite understandable and helpful for patients and for all the different stakeholders there. However, there is not a separate section for IRBs. So you did mention some things that IRBs consider. Is there more or things that they do consider or should consider?
Yeah, primarily the IRB should be focused on the informed consent and making sure it's adequate and well written so people can understand it. But other things that the IRB can look at would be evidence that the patient does in fact lack a satisfactory alternative. That might be an approved product, which the patient has exhausted the approved products. They may be intolerant of an approved product, or maybe there are no products that exist for treating the particular disease or condition that this person has. Uh, and they should also be, as Lisa said, ineligible for a clinical trial, either because they don't meet the inclusion criteria or they're unable to access the trial. It could be because of geographic reasons. Um, Also, I think the IRB should look at whether or not, hopefully they are, the physician and the institution are technically qualified to administer the investigational treatment. Some treatments, things like gene therapy, for example, might require very special expertise or special equipment. Um, is there sufficient data to establish an appropriate dose for the patient? This information usually would come from the investigator's brochure, and it might be based on ongoing clinical trials. Assurance that the sponsor or the manufacturer is actually able and willing to provide the agent, because as Lisa said, they have the basic decision: will they or won't they provide the agent? And I would add, they're not required or mandated to provide product for expanded access. And is there promising pharmacological evidence demonstrating that the agent is reasonably safe and may provide therapeutic benefit, considering the intended use for the patient and the patient for whom it's intended? So essentially, is there a valid rationale? Benefit risk evaluation comes into play here with that pharmacological and clinical evidence. Most of this information is going to come from a copy of the FDA 3926 that is submitted by the physician, and it should be also sent to the IRB, and the treatment plan, which is typically also included in the 3926 form.
Can I just interject here? My ears pricked up when you mentioned evidence, and the idea of evidence and expanded access is both complex and crucial. As I keep reiterating, we're talking about very sick patients who've exhausted other treatment options, so their ability to accurately consider evidence may be affected, and thus their ability to assess benefits and risks. And of course, that goes back to a robust informed consent process. But also, patients can access investigational products via expanded access at any stage of drug development, phase 1, 2, or 3, but they can also access preclinical before they even enter the phases, if you will. And we've seen with individualized drugs, individualized gene therapies, N of one or bespoke or customized gene therapies, that these are products administered via the expanded access pathway where they're is no information or evidence of how they will perform in a human being. And some of the more famous cases of individualized treatments had very, very limited testing in rodents. So again, this idea of evidence and the amount of evidence to make an informed consent decision, um, it's limited sometimes. And I think, again, I'm just emphasizing the importance of having the IRB here, this objective, context specific consideration of evidence and oversight. There's one thing I also wanted to ask about what you were saying, which is one of the things that we hear in medical ethics when people complain about expanded access is that these it takes a while. You have to convene the IRB, you have to review the materials, and this is time that patients who are requesting access via expanded access just don't have. So, can you talk about that? I know that for single patient expanded access, the guidelines changed from a full board requirement to the chair, but I know that it varies according to different products requested and different types of expanded access. Can you review that a little bit, Richard?
Yeah, I think this is a good point to mention that there are actually three tiers of expanded access. There's individual access for a single patient, and that can be emergency use or just an individual IND for expanded access. There's also an intermediate sized patient population protocol for treatment of a cohort up to, say, about 100 people. There are no firm numbers attached to intermediate sized patient population INDs, but there's also a very broad access treatment IND or treatment protocol under which tens of thousands of people can be treated. Usually those do number in the thousands. Uh, but the individual access, the individual patient, is the kind that is most likely to be encountered by an IRB. It's become a lot more common. Um, and I think that's the most common category that will be seen. So at FDA, we were very concerned about the fact that there were complaints about it taking a very long time to get through the process. And one of the aspects of that, or one of the components of that delay, was convening an IRB. So what we tried to do was reduce the amount of time it would take for the IRB review by facilitating, I can't say an expedited review because that's a term that's already taken, but a faster, more streamlined review. So, but it only pertains for individual patient access, and it is dependent upon the physician who's filing for the application or filing for the expanded access use to check off a box on the form 3926. And that box is a request to waive the requirement for the full board review. So for any intermediate patient access protocol or for broad access programs under the treatment IND, full board review is always required. But for a single patient, the chair or the chair's designee can concur with the use of the expanded access product, um, and no further full board review is required. So, Lisa, another interesting facet to all of this, or wrinkle, if you will, um, is access through right to try. Do you want to just say a few words about right to try? Because I think a lot of people get confused between expanded access pathways and the right to try programs.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because people, especially when we're talking about single patient expanded access, also known as compassionate use, that's often used interchangeably with right to try, especially by patients because they are fighting for a right to try a drug. But Right to Try is a political movement that was spearheaded by a libertarian organization in 2014 with the explicit goal of removing FDA oversight of the expanded access process. Their complaint was that the government, the FDA, shouldn't be an obstacle to people trying to save their lives. Now, this is misguided on a few fronts. The first of which is that I don't think anybody would really say that expanded access is intended to save lives. Again, refer to the very sick patient population and the unapproved drugs. And patients are generally looking something that might extend their lives, to may improve their quality of life. But the idea that there's just an obstacle to life-saving medicines is just off base. Uh, First of all, the FDA approves expanded access requests more than 99% of the time, and it does so really quickly. Couple of hours for emergency requests, and the regular requests is usually in a day or two. And also, as I mentioned at the outset, and you've emphasized, Richard, the decision whether to allow access to a drug via the expanded access pathway is the sponsors. They are the gatekeepers to access to their products, their proprietary medical products in development. And FDA and IRBs don't get involved until the sponsor has agreed to allow this access. So to say that the FDA is any kind of obstacle to access it's just not true. So as I mentioned, Right to Try started as a political movement, and it was a state legislative movement. And currently 40 states have right to try laws on the books. However, in 2018, the Federal Right to Try Act was signed, and again, all of the state laws are similar, and the Federal Right to Try law is quite similar. But the whether the state laws supersede the federal, or federal supersede the state, which is more likely, although in medical scenarios there are lots of things that fall to states. That's never been tested in court. But all of it is, we don't spend so much time on it in medical ethics anymore because there's been so little uptake of right to try. The information that's required by companies to report to the FDA that shows how much of their products they provide via right to try showed that there were just 16 instances of this happening between 2018 and 2023, and this is on the FDA site. So, from a purely ethics perspective, right to try foregoes these really important safety guardrails for patients, as we've been discussing this oversight of the informed consent process, the benefits and risks, as well as the protocol and all the other things that you've been mentioning, Richard. Um, so I think also that the reason there's been little uptake by sponsors is because I think they appreciate the IRBs and the FDA's oversight. They like the idea of this kind of backstop and patient protections. And I think that's why sponsors have overwhelmingly preferred expanded access to right to try. I don't think we need to say a ton about it, though it is really important to drive home that right to try and compassionate use and or right to try and expanded access are completely different beasts on regulatory levels, ethical levels, logistical levels. And again, there are a lot of resources for this. And I'll especially point to the Working Group on Compassionate Use and Pre-Approval Access, CUPA. You and I, Richard, are both on that group. We have a really good uh, website, if I do say so myself, and an extensive FAQ that has a lot on right to try, a lot on expanded access to, and IRBs. But especially if people are really interested more in right to try, they can find that there. And while we're talking about resources, before we end, we've mentioned that the resources are available in the show notes, but Richard, are there any FDA or other resources that are specifically for IRBs and expanded access?
There are, and they are in the show notes as resources. There are guidances and guidance for industry that I think are both very effective or useful for IRBs. And I also want to mention that the Reagan-Udall Expanded Access Navigator does not currently have a section specifically for IRBs, but they have one in the works. So I would keep checking back. They are listed in the resources also, the Reagan-Udall Expanded Access Navigator. And you'll be seeing at some point in the relatively near future, I hope, a site specifically intended for IRBs. Currently, it's for industry, physicians, and patients, but they are going to be adding an IRB section. And with that, I would like to turn it back to our host, Susan Court.
Thank you very much, Richard and Lisa, for sharing your insights today. If you have any questions about this topic, please feel free to reach out to us at info@phrptraining.com. We also invite you to subscribe to PHRP Perspectives and look forward to seeing you again next time.